They said the LaSalle bloodline had rotted from within long before the world ever knew their name, not by sickness, not by madness, but by something older. Something that began when a French settler made a pact beneath the swamps of southern Alabama, a pact that was never supposed to outlive him. When the old family spoke of the LaSalle, they didn't use words like human. They called them remnants, flesh born of sin, sealed by hunger. You see, in 1908, when the authorities finally reached their land, the official report spoke only of missing persons, poor hygiene, and deformity through isolation. But that was a lie. The truth, buried under the polite language of government and science, was that the LaSalles had become something else. For decades, their estate had been a place no one entered after dark. Hunters spoke of strange lights, sounds like bones cracking in unison, and figures crawling through the mud as if searching for something they'd lost centuries ago. The locals said the LaSalles didn't just eat flesh. They absorbed it. Ritualistically, purposefully. Every child born on that land bore a mark, a jagged scar along the spine that wasn't surgical, wasn't genetic, but symbolic. The pattern matched a sigil once found in 15th century European occult manuscripts, the same ones banned by the Vatican for ritualistic consumption and transference of essence. Yet when newspapers tried to expose it, the story vanished overnight. The reporter's typewriter was found on his desk, the ribbon soaked in something black and sticky. Not ink. That's how power works, doesn't it? Not by silencing, but by rewriting. By making horror sound like heritage. By turning the word cannibal into isolated family tragedy. But that's not the part they fear you hearing. Because the LaSalles weren't an anomaly. They were a prototype. A living experiment in what happens when a bloodline is sealed off, taught to consume itself, and worship the act as divine. And if you think that experiment ended in 1908, you haven't looked closely enough at the families who still sit behind the curtains, smiling through the banquet smoke, with hunger still in their eyes. When investigators finally breached the LaSalle property in November of 1908, the sun had already died behind a wall of storm clouds. What they found wasn't a home. It was a mausoleum pretending to breathe. The farmhouse stood crooked on its foundations, half sunk into the mud as if the earth itself was trying to bury what lived inside. Windows were nailed shut from within, curtains stiffened with time, and the air, heavy, metallic, swollen with the scent of decay, carried whispers that didn't belong to wind. The officers who entered that night never spoke again in public. Their reports were confiscated, sealed under Federal Confidential Order 29B, but fragments remained. One line survived in the margins of a forgotten document. The walls were lined with bones, not arranged, but grown. It wasn't just a family home, it was an altar built of ancestry. You see, the LaSalles didn't believe in death as an end. They believed it was transferable. Each body consumed, each life taken, was a renewal of lineage, an attempt to escape decay by feeding it. Every ritual meal, every offering of flesh, was meant to preserve the family's purity. They thought the soul could be absorbed through blood, that memory itself could be inherited through marrow. But here's the part they never teach you in history class. Because it connects to something far more systemic. The LaSalles were funded, not by wealth earned through trade or land, but by donations. Silent envelopes sent from northern institutions of study, laboratories, churches, and secret societies that wanted to understand what happens when morality is removed from evolution. The family was observed, not stopped, documented, not destroyed. Because to those in power, the LaSalles were more than monsters. They were data. And that, my friend, is the pattern history repeats. Create horror, observe decay, harvest the resu. Lieutenant, the same blueprint has been used on civilizations, not just families. You isolate them, you feed them lies, then you watch what happens when the human spirit devours itself. They called it psychological containment. We call it control. And it began long before Alabama. Because the LaSalle ritual wasn't born in the South, it was imported from France, from something buried beneath the catacombs of Marseille, where the first LaSalle ancestor signed his name in blood, promising his descendants eternity, no matter the cost. Long before the swamp swallowed their name, before Alabama ever whispered it, the LaSalle bloodline was forged in secrecy beneath the stones of Marseille. It began in the 1600s, when the old world was trading faith for reason, and losing both. Down in the catacombs beneath the streets where plague carts rolled, a sect of noblemen gathered around what they called the Banquet of Rebirth. Their doctrine was simple, horrifyingly so. They believed that divinity was trapped within the flesh of the dying, that when you consumed what was forbidden, you didn't defile yourself, you ascended. They saw the body not as sacred, but as a vessel of transferable power. The earliest records name Etienne LaSalle, a failed theologian turned alchemist. He was obsessed with one idea, that God had hidden immortality not in heaven, but in the bloodstream. He wrote, "To eat the vessel of another is to taste the echo of the eternal." He and 7 others performed what they called the Feast of the Renewal. A child, unclaimed, unnamed, was placed on a stone slab. Blood was collected, not spilled, consumed, not wasted. They spoke of seeing visions, faces of ancestors, voices merging, minds blending, and when it was over, Etienne wrote that his heart slowed but never ceased. He claimed he could feel other memories coursing through him, memories not his own. When the church found out, they didn't execute him, they recruited him. The Jesuit archives, now sealed, record a brief mention. Subject 47 retained for theological observation. That means the church kept him alive, watched him, fed him, studied what he became. And when France began to collapse under revolution, one branch of the LaSalle family fled, carrying Etienne's journals, the ritual diagrams, and the sigil that would later appear on every LaSalle child's spine. They boarded a ship bound for the New World, to a place where no one asked questions, where land was cheap and secrecy was survival. That land was southern Alabama, and in 1813, the LaSalles built their estate over a swamp known by the Creek people as the ground that remembers. The locals avoided it. Animals wouldn't breed near it. And yet the LaSalles thrived, untouched by famine, untouched by disease, because they had learned to feed the hunger that feeds the world itself. When the LaSalles arrived in Alabama, they didn't come as refugees. They came as architects of something older than the nation itself. They built their estate where the river bent unnaturally, where fog clung to the trees even in sunlight. They said the soil was rich, but the locals said it was rich because it had been fed. By the mid-1800s, the LaSalles had become untouchable. They owned land, cotton, and men. But what made them powerful wasn't wealth. It was silence. Their influence grew because they understood something America itself was just learning, that fear is the most reliable currency. They fed it quietly, not just through what they ate, but through what they owned. The LaSalles hosted gatherings masked as religious dinners, harvest suppers, where only the chosen few were invited. Wealthy politicians, judges, even preachers came to their table. None ever spoke of what they saw. Some say because they couldn't, others say because they joined. You see, the ritual had evolved. The LaSalles no longer believed immortality was in flesh alone. It was in obedience. They realized that if you could make another man participate in sin and keep his mouth shut, you owned him forever. That's the real ritual. Shared guilt. It's the same method institutions use now, just dressed in better clothes. Back then, it was a supper table in the dark. Now it's boardrooms, backrooms, and sealed documents. The meal has changed. The control hasn't. In 1847, a traveling minister named Elijah Cross tried to expose them. He wrote letters describing the ritual of communion through consumption and the children bred for sacrifice. 3 days before his sermon, he was found hanging from a pecan tree, his tongue missing, his eyes open toward the LaSalle estate. The local sheriff declared it suicide. The county judge was a LaSalle cousin. And from that day on, the LaSalle name was never spoken in churches again. But that's not the strangest part. The family began receiving money from Washington during Reconstruction, agricultural subsidies. Yet their fields were empty. No crops, no workers, no product, just money flowing in. It was as if someone, somewhere, needed them alive. And when you trace those payments far enough, you find a familiar pattern. The same families funding the LaSalles were later tied to early psychological experimentation programs. Coincidence? No. Continuation. By the turn of the century, science had learned to dress its rituals in lab coats. The LaSalle, once whispered about as monsters, were suddenly subjects, participants in something that looked like progress but smelled like the same old hunger. They called it behavioral conditioning. The goal, they said, was to understand how fear rewires the human mind, but the LaSalles already knew that. They'd been practicing it for generations. A team of physicians from northern institutions arrived quietly in 1902. They came with grants, instruments, and contracts that promised rehabilitation, but no one ever left that property rehabilitated. The locals called them the White Suits. They brought electricity, chloroform, and notebooks filled with strange symbols, the same sigil burned into LaSalle's skin. Only now it was filed under a new term: neurological mapping. You see, when a ritual becomes too obvious, the powerful rename it. Cannibalism becomes biology, possession becomes psychology, and torture becomes therapy. They said the LaSalles were helping advance science, but what they were really doing was providing a test group, a sealed bloodline perfectly suited for generational observation. Scientists studied their sleep cycles, breeding patterns, responses to hunger, and most importantly, their obedience to authority. They wanted to know what happens when submission becomes instinct. This is the point where horror stops being folklore and starts being infrastructure, because those same scientists later founded institutes that shaped the modern understanding of human behavior. One of them, Dr. Edwin Caro, became a key figure in early American intelligence research, the same programs that birthed psychological warfare, media manipulation, and what we now call public compliance. He once wrote in his journal, "The LaSalle lineage presents no resistance to and fear is inherited." That line was never meant to be public, but it survived, barely, in the notes of a journalist who vanished in 1931 while tracing Caro's funding. So ask yourself, if fear can be inherited, who benefits from keeping you afraid? Every generation, the experiment scales up, from one family to one nation, from a basement in Alabama to a screen in your hand. The names changed, the methods evolved, but the formula never died. And maybe that's because the LaSalle ritual wasn't destroyed at all. It was absorbed. After the property was seized in 1908, the LaSalle name officially disappeared from every public record. But disappearing doesn't mean dying, it means integration. Fragments of their bloodline were quietly relocated, absorbed into orphanages, church programs, and state-funded rehabilitation schools across the South. Officially, they were wards of the state. Unofficially, they were templates. The institutions that took them in claimed to be saving children, but their funding told a different story. Every single one of those homes received money from the same network of organizations that had studied the LaSalle. Education was the new laboratory, and obedience the new experiment. The idea was simple: test how early the human will could be broken and rebuilt. Children were rewarded not for learning, but for conforming, punished not for sin, but for doubt. The system learned to do what the LaSalles had done through ritual: erase identity and replace it with compliance. Teachers became priests of a quieter religion, one that worshipped hierarchy, not truth. And while the public thought they were teaching arithmetic and scripture, something deeper was being installed: fear of deviation. You've seen its descendants, the eyes that lower themselves before authority, the voices that say, "It's just the way things are." That's the ritual, perfected, not through flesh, but through repetition. And the most disturbing part, it worked. One of the relocated LaSalle children, a boy named Julien, was studied until adulthood. In 1939, a confidential report labeled him cognitively obedient. His brain scans were used to develop what we now call behavioral conditioning models. You've seen them again, in schools, in advertising, in politics. Patterns of reward and fear designed to shape collective behavior. The LaSalles were never the anomaly. They were the prototype. Their ritual became psychology. Their hunger became policy. So when people tell you the past is gone, remember this: what was tested on a family is now tested on a civilization. The altar just got bigger, and if you think you're immune, try breaking a rule that everyone else obeys without question, and see how quickly the system shows you its teeth. By the 1940s, war gave the world a reason to industrialize fear. Governments needed control, obedience, and silence. Three things the LaSalle experiment had already perfected. You see, when people are told that their suffering serves a higher cause, they stop calling it suffering. They call it duty. That's how the ritual survived, hidden beneath the flag. Declassified memos from 1943 describe Project Renewal, a series of psychological studies aimed at understanding compliance under stress. The language is sterile. The reality wasn't. The test subjects were orphans, inmates, and volunteers from mental institutions, many of them descendants of the families relocated from the LaSalle estate. Coincidence? The documents say otherwise. Funding trails link directly back to the same organizations that once financed the LaSalle rehabilitation. Behind the language of science, the pattern remained: isolation, deprivation, reward, control through ritual. They didn't need chains anymore. They had conditioning. But something else emerged. A word that shouldn't exist in scientific language: hunger. Reports describe subjects exhibiting craving for command. Not food, not freedom. Command. They wanted to be told what to do. They needed it, as if obedience itself had become nourishment. That's the inheritance, the LaSalle gift to the modern world. When a man stops trusting his own will, he becomes a vessel waiting to be filled, and every system, from government to religion to commerce, was built to fill him. After the war, those same scientists were absorbed into what later became intelligence agencies. They brought their data, their methods, and their faith in fear. The LaSalle ritual had evolved into a doctrine of power. Obedience is control, and control is currency. And if you look closely, you can still see the signature. That jagged spine mark, stylized now, it is a corporate logo, a political emblem, a seal stamped on institutions that promise safety in exchange for silence. The ritual was never about cannibalism. It was about assimilation. They stopped eating flesh and started eating minds. That's why history forgets them, because they became history. The bloodline didn't die, it scaled. When the war ended, the battlefield shifted. No more trenches, no more mud. The new front line was the human mind, and the LaSalle doctrine fit the times perfectly. The scientists who once mapped fear in isolated bloodlines now mapped it in entire populations. They called it public relations. They called it marketing. But beneath the polished words was the same old ritual: control through appetite. The LaSalle principle was simple: if a man's hunger defines him, then control what he hungers for. In the 1950s, that meant shaping desire, not through truth, but through repetition. Television became the altar, the screen, the candle, the voice that told you what to buy, what to love, what to fear. That was the priest. And America listened. Edward Bernays, nephew of Freud, student of suggestion, once wrote, "We govern by shaping the habits and opinions of the masses." He wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was describing the conversion of ancient ritual into modern propaganda. Replace the sacrifice with a slogan. Replace the sigil with a brand. The result is the same: worship wrapped in choice. But where did Bernays learn it? Who taught the mechanics of invisible influence? In 1951, he attended a private symposium funded by an unnamed foundation, tracing its roots to the Behavioral Studies Group, the same network tied to the LaSalle experiments. Hidden in plain sight, the lineage had survived, just wearing suits now instead of skin. You see, the LaSalles never cared about blood anymore. They cared about patterns. They realized that control wasn't maintained through violence. It was maintained through the illusion of freedom. Give a man two options, both leading to the same master, and he'll swear he's chosen. That's how the doctrine metastasized, from swamp to state, from ritual to regulation. The hunger once fed on flesh, now fed on attention. Your time became me, the meal, your thoughts, the wine. And when they built the television networks, the newspapers, and eventually the digital echo chambers, they weren't just informing you, they were feeding on you. Because the LaSalle curse wasn't extinction, it was expansion. The appetite went global. By the 1960s, the hunger had learned to wear a smile. The world called it progress. The LaSalle doctrine called it possession by comfort. Because once a man believes the system exists to serve him, he never realizes it feeds on him instead. Television was no longer enough. They needed immersion. They needed men to participate willingly in their own containment. So they gave you choice, color, and convenience. They called it the American dream, but it was the same ritual, rebranded for mass consumption. The LaSalle symbol, the curve along the spine, appeared again, hidden this time in the design of corporate emblems and military insignias. The same geometry, the same intent, control through familiarity. Psychologists who once studied obedience now became cultural architects. They taught advertisers how to bypass the rational mind and speak directly to the limbic, the seat of emotion, hunger, and fear. One 1964 document from the Institute for Human Dynamics states, television programming can elicit compliance comparable to direct authority when emotional triggers are sustained beyond conscious filtering. That means the screen could command you, not with force, with rhythm, with repetition, the ritual of obedience, now performed through pixels. But this wasn't only about money. It was about identity transference. The same principle Etienne LaSalle wrote centuries ago. To consume is to become. Only now the consumption was mental. Each image you absorbed became part of you. Every advertisement, every fear broadcast, every tragedy repeated. It carved symbols into your subconscious, like markings on bone. And here's the secret they never wanted you to see. Once you define yourself through what they sell you, you stop being you. You become the experiment, the next LaSalle, bred not by blood, but by belief. So let me ask you, if your thoughts, your wants, your fears are engineered, what part of you remains untouched? Comment below. I see the hunger. Write it again, not for me, but for you, because awareness breaks the ritual. The words are the blade. The act of seeing turns the mirror back toward them. We are only halfway down, and from here, the descent grows darker. When the Cold War began, the hunger found a uniform. The world called it espionage, but beneath the codes and covert files was the same old theology: control the mind, control the body, control the story, control the world. The LaSalle doctrine had finally gone global. Governments feared bombs, but they worshipped information. They learned that a weapon could be invisible. An idea, planted deep enough, could rot a civilization from within. And that's where the descendants of the LaSalle Project re-emerged. No longer the inbred cannibals of Alabama, but behavioral scientists embedded in new intelligence networks. Their research on obedience inheritance became the backbone of psychological operations. In 1959, a memo circulated between agencies under a project codenamed Cathedral. It described cultural infiltration through emotional saturation. The strategy was chillingly simple: make people feel until they stop thinking. The result? Predictable behavior, programmable faith. Radio became sermon, cinema became scripture, fear became the new communion. Every crisis televised, every speech rehearsed, every anthem weaponized, all feeding the same invisible altar: obedience through emotion. And while the world watched superpowers threaten each other with extinction, a quieter extinction was unfolding: the death of discernment, the ability to tell truth from design. The LaSalle principle was now institutional. You weren't forced to kneel anymore. You chose to, because it felt righteous. But behind the scenes, the families funding the earliest intelligence think tanks were the same bloodlines that had financed the LaSalle estate 2 centuries earlier. The sigil of the spine, the symbol of eternal hunger, was now etched into classified insignias, reappearing in seals of covert divisions. Coincidence? No. Continuity. Every society needs a myth to justify its counterfeit. The LaSalles gave them the perfect one, the myth of safety. Tell a man he's protected and he'll surrender everything worth protecting. That's how the ritual survived, disguised as patriotism, cloaked in secrecy, guarded by men who believed they were the shepherds of a fragile world. But the truth is simpler and far more terrifying. The shepherds were just better-fed wolves. You were never the protected, you were the resource. When the first frost of November touched Louisiana, the Broussard farmhouse began to creak differently. The wood groaned not from cold, but from memory. Hunters passing by claimed they could smell iron in the air, something like blood, whenever the wind hit from the east. Inside, the eldest Broussard boy, Claude, had taken to sitting near the fireplace, muttering prayers no one taught him. His mother, pale and silent, scrubbed the same spot on the floor until her fingers bled. No one dared ask why. But one night, a stranger did. A traveling preacher stopped by, lost on his way to Baton Rouge. He was offered supper and a place by the fire. He noticed the family's uneasy silence, the way their eyes darted to the floorboards whenever the wind howled. As the night deepened, the preacher asked a question that made the room still. "Who's buried beneath your feet?" Claude's spoon clattered. The mother's hands froze mid-wash. For a full minute only the fire cracked. Then, with a voice rough and wet, the patriarch spoke. "No one. Not anymore." The preacher's face drained of color. He stood to leave, but as he did, the boards beneath his boots shifted. A low, hollow creak rose from below, followed by something that sounded like a child's sigh. He backed away, but before he reached the door, a sudden thud came from beneath the floor, like a fist striking from below. Then another, then three more, rhythmic, desperate, alive. Claude began to cry. The mother screamed, and the patriarch, his face twisted, eyes gleaming with madness, took up the poker from the fire and slammed it against the floor, again and again shouting, stay down where you belong." When the preacher fled into the cold night, he swore he heard the sound of multiple voices beneath the farmhouse, young, old, whispering in unison, calling out a single word that made his bones turn to ice. "Brother." And from that night on, no traveler who passed the Broussard land stayed long enough to see the sunrise. Beneath the Louisiana soil, the Broussard property held secrets older than the house itself. In the back corner of the yard, half hidden by overgrown brush, was a well, its stones slick with moss, its darkness a mouth that seemed to breathe. The children were warned never to approach it, yet every generation did. Curiosity, it seems, is a hunger stronger than fear. In 1908, young Marie Broussard, barely 10, wandered close during a storm. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the well just long enough for her to see what lay within. Faces, dozens of them, pressed against the stones from below, eyes wide and mouths open in silent screams. They weren't ghosts, not in the way the living imagine. They were trapped. Marie ran screaming, but the faces followed her, not with sight, but with memory, the kind that burrows under your skin. She spent the night clutching her bed, whispering to herself, trying to convince herself that the well was empty, that she had only imagined the eyes. But imagination has a smell, metallic, sour, undeniable. The patriarch caught her the next morning, his hands cold and rough. He whispered a warning that would echo through every future generation. The well remembers. The well feeds, and the well never forgives. The well became ritual. Twice a week, a candle was lowered to the bottom, smoke curling into the darkness, a smoke meant to soothe whatever lived beneath. And later, when the family began their more sinister practices, the well became their altar. Flesh would disappear into its depth, leaving only echoes, leaving only the smell of iron in the morning air. No outsider ever saw what went in, and those who tried to investigate vanished quietly. Letters arrived weeks later, unsigned, describing a nightmarish sound, the sound of many mouths, not eating, but waiting. The lesson, as the family grew older and more insular, was clear. The well was not a tool, it was a teacher. It demanded obedience. It showed what happens when curiosity meets lineage, and it whispered truths about hunger, power, and legacy that no schoolbook could contain. If you think this is a story from the past, think again. Wells like this exist everywhere, hidden in plain sight. The faces, the hunger, the ritual, they've all been abstracted into institutions, into practices, into the very rules you follow without question. And now, standing above that well, you feel a whisper of it yourself, don't you? By the early 20th century, the LaSalle and Broussard bloodlines were no longer isolated anomalies. They had begun to intertwine. The meeting wasn't marked by fanfare or formal alliances. It was a convergence born of necessity, of understanding that power, when contained in one family, can be fragile, but when shared, becomes unstoppable. Descendants of the LaSalles, who had fled the swamps of Alabama after exposure and government intervention, traveled quietly across state lines, seeking others like themselves. The Broussards, masters of subterranean terror and ritual, were already established in the fertile backwoods of Louisiana. When they met, it wasn't friendship that guided them. It was recognition. Each saw in the other the same glint in the eyes, hunger, patience, and a willingness to endure horror to achieve mastery. Together, they created a network, not a gang, not a cult, something subtler, a blueprint for influence that could span generations without anyone knowing. They traded knowledge. The LaSalles shared the science of inherited obedience and psychological conditioning. The Broussards shared the art of concealment, ritual, and how to make fear a living organism in itself. They also intermarried deliberately, controlling bloodlines, ensuring that the next generation was optimized, resilient, compliant, and most disturbingly, self-replicating in its loyalty to the hidden system. Every child became both heir and vessel. Letters from 1912, now partially destroyed, hint at their ambitions. The work is not merely to survive, but to be remembered as a shadow no one can name. And that shadow did more than survive. By the 1920s, these bloodlines had placed agents in local governments, schools, and churches. Not openly, not by bribery alone. They used the same method the LaSalles had perfected centuries ago: shared complicity, fear of the unknown, guilt of participation, loyalty born from obedience. Every institution they touched bent subtly to their will, shaping public perception without leaving a trace of their presence. It was invisible architecture, a map of influence laid over the South, connecting rituals in barns, cellars, and wells with policy decisions, with what the public was told to fear, to desire, to obey. The families became conduits for power itself, the living proof that corruption and control could be inherited, taught, and codified. And while this network grew quietly, the world at large slept, blind to the fact that horror, carefully curated and disguised as normalcy, had become law. By 1923, a quiet movement began sweeping through American universities, a fascination with the science of the mind. The newspapers called it progress. The LaSalle-Broussard network called it harvest. You see, the same techniques their ancestors used to break the will of kin, starvation, isolation, repetition, and ritual, were now being studied, sterilized, and repackaged as behavioral conditioning. The very horrors born in candlelit barns were reborn under fluorescent light, wearing the mask of science. Records from the University of Alabama and Tulane mention anonymous donors funding research into obedience thresholds, studies where subjects were deprived of light, sound, or human contact for days, then rewarded for compliance. No one knew those donors shared a name with a family whose rituals had always revolved around control through deprivation. The LaSalle-Broussard descendants learned something their ancestors could never have imagined. Fear, if quantified, becomes policy. The moment a man's reaction to pain could be measured, it could be engineered, and once it could be engineered, it could be sold. By the 1930s, their network had shifted from hidden homesteads to government-backed laboratories. Publicly, it was framed as the study of human behavior. Privately, it was about replication, about transferring what once belonged to a few deranged bloodlines into the bloodstream of society itself. They found partners, psychologists, military officers, philanthropists, each drawn not by belief in evil, but by fascination with control. They weren't evil men, at least not in their own eyes. They were engineers of obedience, convinced they were building something noble. And isn't that the most dangerous kind of villain, the one who thinks he's saving you while chaining your mind? The LaSalle-Broussard method became the seed for programs that would later shape war propaganda, advertising, even education. Their influence stretched from psychiatric wards to pulpits, from classrooms to the assembly line. They learned that if you condition a population early enough, if you control the rhythm of their fear, you never need chains again. The people will build their own. The legacy of cannibalism wasn't just about flesh anymore. It had evolved. What once devoured bodies now devoured will, and it did so quietly, efficiently, invisibly. The family no longer needed a cellar to feed. The entire system had become their banquet. By the mid-20th century, the LaSalle-Broussard network understood something fundamental. The human mind craves meaning. Fear alone compels obedience, but faith makes it permanent. And so they began to weaponize belief. Religion, patriotism, and the promise of moral righteousness became the new altars, invisible yet impossible to resist. Churches became laboratories. Sermons, meticulously crafted, measured responses to guilt and fear. Hymns weren't just songs, they were rituals, rehearsing submission week after week. Preachers who complied were rewarded with influence. Those who questioned were quietly removed. Obedience became a currency, faith a test of loyalty. Meanwhile, patriotism served as a broader framework. Wars, crises, and national emergencies were opportunities, not tragedies. They trained entire generations to transfer their hunger for guidance to flags, emblems, and institutions. The LaSalle doctrine adapted perfectly: consume authority, consume identity. The bloodline's hunger had evolved into cultural appetite. By the 1950s, textbooks, civic ceremonies, and mass media all carried the same signature. Messages of compliance were delivered not by chains or fear, but through rituals disguised as civic duty. Children who had no direct exposure to the original families were now being shaped by the echo of centuries-old practices. And just as the LaSalles once observed the obedient, the network monitored the populace. They tracked conformity, rewarded compliance, and quietly isolated deviation. The methods were modern, but the principle remained unchanged. Control the flesh, control the mind, control the mind, control the soul. Here's the cruel genius. This system didn't just demand obedience, it bred it. It taught people to police themselves, to accept restriction as guidance, and to mistake compliance for freedom. Families repeated rituals on no eyes. Schools reinforced them, media amplified them, and in every home, the invisible chains tightened with every repetition, every chant, every pledge. And now, if you are listening closely, you can trace the same principles in your world today. The institutions that promise protection, identity, and morality are feeding the same hunger that began in a swamp centuries ago. It is subtle, it is relentless, and it is always hungry. Comment again. I see the hunger. Twice for reinforcement. Twice because acknowledging it is the first act of reclaiming your will. By the 1960s, the LaSalle-Broussard hunger had found a new altar: entertainment. The world called it television, cinema, music. The network called it ritual in light and sound. They realized that controlling fear alone was no longer enough. Now they could shape desire, attention, and identity simultaneously. Pleasure became the lever. Programs were designed to evoke rhythm and repetition, the same pattern the LaSalles had perfected with flesh and ritual. Children watched, adults watched, families gathered, all unknowingly participating in exercises of compliance. Emotional triggers were calculated: laughter, suspense, love, and terror, delivered in precise sequences, creating neural pathways that conditioned responses before conscious thought could intervene. Advertisers became the modern priests. Their sermons were visual, their offerings commercialized, their altars made of screens. Each product, each narrative, each repeated trope, designed to feed obedience, mask hunger, and make consumption habitual. The LaSalle-Broussard principle had evolved: feed the body with pleasure, and the mind follows willingly. Music, too, was weaponized. Tempo and repetition mirrored ritualistic rhythm. Messages seeped through melody, embedding obedience into desire. The viewer was not just entertained, they were ritual participants, complicit in a system they would never recognize. And the elite observed. As the families had once done in Alabama and Louisiana, they studied patterns. What caused engagement? What evoked attachment? What triggered fear? By measuring attention, pleasure, and repetition, they could anticipate behavior, predict response, and manipulate mass populations, all under the guise of entertainment. Even the modern idea of celebrity is a product of this system, figures elevated not solely for talent, but for their ability to enforce identification, to reign, force patterns of desire and loyalty, to feed the invisible altar. Each fan's attention, each click, each consumed narrative is a sacrifice offered willingly. And while you may think you are free in choosing what you watch, listen, or follow, the ritual is already working. Your mind, trained by generations of perfected obedience, is serving without knowledge. The feast is not on the screen. It is in you. You've likely been told that bloodlines fade, that power disperses over time, dissolving into the masses. That's the myth they built to protect themselves. The truth is colder. The LaSalle-Broussard bloodlines never vanished. They learned to mutate. Through marriages, name changes, and migrations, their lineage dissolved into respectability. But their doctrine, their ancient devouring method, survived intact. By the 1970s, descendants occupied seats in academia, government, and corporate hierarchies, not as overt tyrants, but as architects of consensus. Their faces changed, but their rituals remained. The altar was no longer made of stone. It was institutional. The LaSalle descendants specialized in behavioral manipulation, becoming experts in marketing and psychology. The Broussard lineage gravitated toward policy, ethics boards, and philanthropy, the gatekeepers of moral narrative. Together, they engineered a system where obedience wasn't imposed from above, it was cultivated from within. Every innovation that promised freedom, the screen, the vote, the algorithm, became another mirror reflecting back control. They didn't need to command you directly, they only needed to shape what you believe freedom looks like. And they were masters of that illusion. Their bloodlines, now hidden behind foundations and think tanks, directed movements, sponsored social campaigns, and quietly influenced cultural trends. They understood what their ancestors had discovered in the swamps of Alabama and the cellars of Louisiana. Control is most effective when it feels like choice. You see, the LaSalle-Broussard legacy isn't about monsters hiding in the dark. It's about systems that make the dark feel safe. They learned to feed without feeding, to harvest without blood, to enslave without chains. And perhaps that is the purest evolution of their hunger. Even the algorithm is that govern what you see, what you buy, what you believe. They carry the same ancestral logic, a digital extension of the ritual. Observe, reward, repeat. The sacrifice now is attention. The altar is your feed. The offering is your focus. The question isn't whether their influence still exists, it's whether you can still see it. When war reshapes the world, it doesn't just redraw borders, it rewrites morality. By the dawn of the Cold War, the LaSalle-Broussard descendants had already embedded themselves within the veins of the New World Order. The hunger that once consumed bodies now consumed information. They saw opportunity in paranoia. Fear was no longer a family ritual. It had become national policy. Governments wanted tools to manipulate minds, to fracture loyalty, to build obedience disguised as patriotism, and so, quietly, the descendants of those two bloodlines slipped into the machinery of intelligence. Documents declassified decades later would refer vaguely to behavioral experiments, human conditioning studies, and psychological weaponry. The public knows fragments of these stories, whispered names like MK Ultra, Project Monarch, and others lost to deliberate erasure. But behind those initials, buried in administrative language, the pattern reappears. The LaSalle signature: deprivation, obedience, hunger for control. The Broussard creed: ritual, guilt, reward. Together, these principles became the foundation for what agencies called compliance conditioning. Civilians, soldiers, even entire populations were shaped without realizing it. The techniques that began in dirt cellars and blood-soaked rituals were now funded by governments and universities. Think about it. The very families once hunted as monsters had become consultants, researchers, and policymakers. The same hunger that once whispered through the swamps now spoke through microphones and boardrooms. They had evolved from cannibals to curators of thought. The Cold War didn't just create a conflict between nations. It created a battlefield for the human mind. Fear was the currency, secrecy the weapon, and every time the public was told to look east or west, the real control deepened. Inward. Obedience became global, reinforced by media, education, and law. But here's what the documents never stated openly. Some of the earliest subjects in these experiments shared a specific genetic marker, traced to the same southern families buried in history. Coincidence or preservation? What began as a bloodline had now become infrastructure. Invisible, self-replicating, fed by the very paranoia it created. The institutions designed to protect you had become the modern ritual. And the whisper continues. The greatest form of control is convincing the controlled that they are free. When the wars ended and the bombs went silent, the laboratories didn't close. They simply rebranded. The language of national security became the language of economic growth. The men who once studied obedience in sealed rooms were now hired by corporations to study desire. The battlefield had changed. The mission had not. The LaSalle-Broussard descendants understood the transition before anyone else. They saw that governments rise and fall, but markets endure. Control to survive must evolve, and so they embedded themselves where the next great ritual would take place, the marketplace. Advertising was no longer about persuasion, it was about programming. Each slogan, each image, each jingle, designed not to sell a product, but to condition identity. The system learned to feed hunger endlessly while never satisfying it. Pleasure became the leash, convenience the chain. They called it consumer behavior analysis, but it was the same doctrine the families had practiced for centuries. Measure the subject, control the pattern, reward the obedience. The modern subject was not tortured, he was entertained. He volunteered his data, his habits, his soul, in exchange for comfort. The Broussard influence thrived in philanthropy, guiding ethical marketing, corporate responsibility, and public wellness initiatives. Their ancestors had offered sacrifices to the well, now they offered them to the algorithm. The goal was identical: feed the structure, starve the individual will. By the 1980s, consumption itself had become the new ritual. Shopping malls, television commercials, and celebrity endorsements were temples, collective ceremonies of submission performed under neon light. Every purchase reaffirmed obedience, every desire, shaped by unseen architects, deepened the trance. You were told this was prosperity, you were told this was freedom. But look closer. The same pattern repeats: the invocation, advertisement, the offering, purchase, and the reward, momentary pleasure. Ancient ritual, modern form. They no longer needed to hide in the swamps or whisper in the dark. Their altars stood in plain sight, glowing, humming, waiting for you to kneel before them each time you reached for what you thought was choice. And now, the hunger has gone global. The system doesn't need your blood, it only needs your attention. And every moment you surrender it, the ritual continues. The moment the world connected through screens, the LaSalle-Broussard legacy achieved what every generation before them had only dreamed of: a single, living network of obedience. No more wells, no more barns, no more flesh and bone, just data, pulsing, trackable, eternal. The digital age didn't create control, it perfected it. The same principles that once governed ritual, observation, repetition, response, became the architecture of the internet itself. Every click, every pause, every hesitation was measured. Every reaction was fed back into the system, teaching it what to feed you next. It wasn't merely surveillance, it was harvest. Social media transformed the hunger into something divine. Attention became the new currency of devotion. The user became both priest and sacrifice, worshipping their own reflection through algorithmic mirrors, each post, each like, each share, a silent reenactment of a ritual that began in the dirt centuries ago. The LaSalle descendants had long since merged with corporations, think tanks, and intelligence agencies. The Broussards had evolved into cultural engineers, psychologists, ethicists, and digital ethic overseers. Together, they designed feedback loops that guided emotion, opinion, and desire across entire populations. And here's the most devastating truth. The algorithm doesn't control you directly. It simply studies your hunger and learns how to feed it back to you until you forget it was ever yours. That's the perfection of the LaSalle doctrine, control through self-indulgence, obedience disguised as expression. They discovered that identity itself could be digitized, not by law but by preference. The system didn't have to tell you who to be. It only had to make you choose from a menu it created. Privacy was never lost. It was traded, piece by piece, willingly, eagerly, because they taught you to believe that. Visibility was validation. You were trained to crave it. The ritual became the rhythm of your day. Wake, scroll, react, repeat. And the digital cathedral grows taller with every upload, every confession, every fragment of your life you offer to it. You don't even feel the chain anymore. It hums softly, disguised as connection, disguised as belonging. You are not the user. You are the resource. By the time the new millennium began, the LaSalle-Broussard descendants no longer needed to experiment. The system was running itself, a self-feeding organism built from data, emotion, and belief. But they weren't satisfied with control of behavior. They wanted something deeper, control of emotion. They realized that if they could dictate what people felt, what they loved, feared, and hated, they could guide entire societies without ever being seen. So they turned their focus toward emotional engineering. It began with outrage. Outrage spreads faster than truth because it feels righteous. It convinces you that your anger is your own, but it isn't. It's designed. Every algorithmic tweak, every trending topic, every flash of conflict is a chemical experiment conducted at scale. You're being tested, your pulse, your reactions, your attention span, all measured, refined, weaponized. The LaSalle descendants funded emotional analytics firms, companies that monitor mass sentiment and predict unrest before it happens. The Broussard lineage directed think tanks that convert that data into narrative. They no longer needed soldiers or slaves. The battlefield was belief itself. They learned that division is the perfect form of control. When people hate each other, they forget to look upward. When emotion runs high, reason falls silent. The same principle that once kept their family loyal, shared fear, now keeps entire nations subdued. And the irony, you think you're fighting oppression while feeding it. Every argument, every comment, every click that fuels the system tightens its grasp. The digital ritual is complete when you participate willingly. The machine doesn't force obedience, it seduces it. You defend your own cage because it gives you an identity, a cause, a side to belong to. That's the brilliance. Obedience through division, control through chaos. And when the system needs to reset, it simply floods you with entertainment, distraction, pleasure, the lullaby between storms. The LaSalle hunger never sleeps. It oscillates. Rage and relief, outrage and comfort, endlessly alternating to keep you spinning, reacting, feeding. Look around. Every conflict, every viral outrage, every trending illusion is a mirror held before you. The reflection feels real because it's made of your own emotion, but it isn't yours anymore. When the sheriff arrived at the Broussard property, the fields were burning. The fire licked across the cane rows like a serpent of light, and the smoke rose thick and black into the Louisiana sky. But it was not the crops that burned. It was the house. The once proud Broussard estate stood half-collapsed, its white pillars turned to grey bones, its roof caved in like a chest crushed by the weight of sin. Inside, they found traces of a struggle, overturned furniture, blood on the walls, and a letter, half-burned, lying beside the old widow's chair. The sheriff, a man too superstitious for his own badge, refused to touch it. But one deputy, young and foolish, did. He unfolded what remained. The letter was written in a trembling hand, words blurred by heat and ash. To whoever finds this, there are no Broussards left. We've been consumed by what we called our own blood. The final line was barely legible, scratched in like a wound. They walk at night, whispering beneath the floorboards. God forgive us, we fed our own. When they found the widow herself, she was sitting by the hearth, her right hand charred to the bone, still clutching a lock of human hair. The deputy who touched the letter later told the priest that her eyes never closed. Even in death they glared toward the staircase, toward the cellar door that hung open like a mouth. He swore that when the wind shifted, he heard laughter coming from below. And though the fire had devoured the house, the cellar never burned. Its walls were damp, untouched by flame, and inside it, beneath the cracked stones, lay bones, hundreds of them, some animal, some not. The cellar beneath the Broussard estate was not ordinary. Investigators, historians, and even local priests who dared enter described it as unnatural. The air was thick, damp, and carried a metallic tang that no ventilation could erase. Even in the winter months, the stone walls radiated a faint warmth, as if the earth itself refused to reclaim what had been buried within. Bones lay scattered, some crushed, some arranged in patterns too deliberate to be accidental. Charred remnants of ritual objects, candles and fragments of clothing littered the floor. But what terrified the witnesses most were the impressions in the dirt, footprints that appeared and disappeared unaccounted for by any living person. The cellar seemed to breathe, expanding slightly as if the walls themselves were alive, inhaling the air around them. One historian, obsessed with tracing the LaSalle-Broussard network, noted an unsettling detail. Many of the bones appeared recent, not decades old, but months old, and some still bore traces of flesh. Whoever, or whatever, was using the cellar had continued their rituals in secret long after the world assumed the family was extinguished. Local legends grew around this cellar. Children dared each other to approach the ruins, whispering that if you listened closely, you could hear the whisper of commands. Obedience, they claimed, could be felt in the bones themselves. The cellar remembered, demanded, and enforced. Even skeptics who entered alone reported a sudden chill, the kind that stiffens muscles and freezes thought. Anthropologists who studied similar family rituals noted the same principle. A location infused with repeated acts of control, sacrifice, and fear becomes a conduit. It accumulates memory, almost like a battery storing centuries of ritual energy. This cellar, they warned, was not just a structure. It was a living testament to the LaSalle-Broussard method of inherited dominance. And here lies the truth no historian dared speak aloud. The legacy of control doesn't die with the flesh. It endures in stone, in soil, in air. The cellar's influence stretched beyond walls, reaching anyone who trespassed, anyone curious enough to seek the story, anyone whose mind could be touched by its rhythm. The whispers weren't myth, they were instruction. Even now they echo in your mind as you hear this. The LaSalle-Broussard doctrine did not die with the last fire, the last cellar, or the last whispered command. It evolved, infiltrating institutions that shape thought, culture, and behavior on a mass scale. Governments, corporations, media conglomerates, educational systems, all became vessels for the same ancient principles: control through ritual, obedience through repetition, and identity through subtle manipulation. Consider modern surveillance systems. Every data point you generate, the websites you visit, the things you search for, the friends you keep, feeds a network built on centuries of behavioral understanding. Algorithms analyze patterns of fear, desire, and loyalty. They anticipate your reactions, craft your cravings, and even direct your attention without you realizing it. Obedience is no longer enforced by punishment, it is coaxed by convenience and curated distraction. Advertising, entertainment, and social media are the modern rituals. Likes, views, and shares serve as offerings. The act of participating feels voluntary, liberating, even empowering. But beneath it, the mechanism is ancient. The LaSalle-Broussard principle remains: measure, manipulate, repeat. Pleasure replaces pain, consent replaces coercion, yet the effect is identical. Even political movements, marketed as revolutions of the people, carry the same signature. Leaders are elevated not solely for merit, but for their ability to direct collective belief, to create loyalty, to mobilize emotions in predictable patterns. The modern altar is digital, infinite and invisible, yet it feeds on the same need for structure, fear and belonging that the old families once harvested in barns and cellars. And the most disturbing truth? You participate willingly. You reinforce the system by thinking you are making choices. Every time you scroll, every time you click, every time you argue or defend your identity online, you feed the network. The hunger persists, invisible but insatiable. It has outlasted empires, outlasted morality, and it now thrives in the very devices you hold in your hands. The lesson is stark. Power, once learned, never truly dies. It mutates, disguises itself, and waits for the next opportunity to perpetuate control. And now, the altar is everywhere, and you are already standing at it. Now, listen closely, because this is where the story stops being distant history and becomes your reality. The LaSalle-Broussard hunger is not confined to swamps, cellars, or burned estates. It exists in the rhythm of your life, in the subtle shaping of your thoughts, your choices, your identity. Every decision you believe is free has already been guided, measured, and anticipated. Look at yourself. Every desire, every fear, every allegiance carries the echo of centuries of ritualized control. The altar has grown beyond stone, beyond flesh. It now resides in your mind, your attention, your habits. Every pattern you repeat, every ritual you obey, even unconsciously, strengthens it. You are not the master here. You are the vessel. The LaSalle-Broussard doctrine thrives because it teaches obedience through perceived autonomy. You think you are resisting, you think you are choosing, yet every thought, every impulse, every reflection has already passed through centuries of calibration. The horror is simple. You participate in your own containment willingly. And now you understand why the warnings never made sense in history books. The system doesn't need overt monsters anymore. It hides in the ordinary. Notifications, slogans, celebrations, rituals, entertainment. Your compliance has been cultivated by design. The cellar, the well, the barns, they are gone, but their principles endure. You are living in their cathedral now, and every habit, every belief, every fleeting pleasure feeds it. Here is the final truth. Recognizing the system is the first act of defiance. Naming the hunger, acknowledging that your identity, your desires, your very focus has been shaped by forces older than you, is the beginning of reclamation. But beware, once seen, it cannot be unseen. You cannot return to ignorance. You are marked by knowledge. So when you close your eyes tonight and, when the screens go dark, ask yourself, which of my desires are truly mine? Which of my fears are inherited from shadows I never met? The LaSalle-Broussard legacy is not a story, it is a living ritual, and now you are part of it. The choice is no longer about obedience, it is about awareness.